Welcome everyone to the next lecture in the series of our continuing education. Today we have with us Donald Weber. He will take us through grant writing, which I think it's one of the topics that in the community is quite in demand, because I know a lot of you are applying to grants or trying to get funding for your long-term projects. And also for some particular projects. So Donald, thank you so much for responding to our request. I'll just ask you maybe to briefly present yourself to, as I said, not miss any of the detail from your long career as a photographer, professor, and coming from other backgrounds such as architecture as well.
Sure, great. Okay, yeah, well, welcome everybody to grant writing. I'll talk much more specifically about certain things, but yeah, I was actually a member of VII from 2007 to early 2016, so it's nice to sort of be back in the fold, albeit in this digital capacity. So yeah, I've been a photographer for more than 20 years now. For the last almost 10 years, I've been a professor, first in the Netherlands, and now lately I'm at Aalto University in Helsinki, Finland, where I'm running the master's photography program. I started, like many of you, in newspapers and then photojournalism, working for international clients, you know, Newsweek, those kinds of things. Working on global stories and such. And for me, I definitely noticed the first, say, major downturn in the media market for me was about 2008, 9, and 10, where things were suddenly dramatically altered in that landscape. And it was also around that same time when I had started applying for grants, not really knowing why. I think more probably out of like as a certain, let's say, symbol of success. But then suddenly I realized that, oh, wait a second, this is money that I can actually go out and create stories, and I don't necessarily need to, say, rely upon a certain editorial client. But the other thing I kind of want to stress today about the grant writing is, for me, writing has become like an absolutely vital part of my practice. There's been many opportunities and times where, because I had started that writing process, I've been able to get assignments or commissions or work in some kind of collaboration, because I'm sort of always perpetually thinking about what my work is, how is the work, and in which ways can I say communicate that to an external audience. So for me, of course, getting a nice check from some funder is a wonderful thing, but I would say even more important is grant writing, and writing in general is a way of really attaining clarity and let's say almost being able to articulate who and what you are as a photographer, which means when you're able to communicate that, you can actually start communicating with other partners, let's say beyond the usual suspects. So that is being able to identify yeah, certain potential collaborators that might not necessarily traditionally fund you. And I'll give you an example of that when we start this presentation. So before I do begin, I should give you the caveat that it's going to be a lot of information. So I'm going to just kind of move almost like a bulldozer. So feel free to, like, whatever, screen grab your computer screen, because I've got lots of slides. I think the best way to be efficient, because there is so much ground to cover, is to mostly pool your questions till the very end. And also I find the Q&A is actually the most valuable part of the presentation, so I can also talk about specifics and such. Usually when I would do this workshop, it's actually an 8-hour and sometimes even a 2-day workshop. So I'm compressing things into an hour and a bit. So there are certain things that I'm actually not going to cover. I'll point to them, but I'm not necessarily going to go in depth. What I really want to focus on is giving you some insight into that writing process, try to give you some clarity, some tools, some assistance in how to maybe set up a writing practice so you can begin and start applying for grants. And the other thing, very important, is this is not like a set of keys that that I'm giving you, but what I am doing is showing my own process. So this is what's worked for me. It might not work for you, but there certainly are going to be some things that you can take forward with you. So on that note, I say we begin.
That's perfect. Yeah. Just again, put your questions in the Q&A. We'll monitor them with Donald, and I'll alert if there's something specific that you don't understand during in between the lecture. Just alert me, and then I'll ask a question to Donald.
Yeah. Okay. So I always like to start with this slide. I think it's kind of funny, but it's also kind of appropriate. You know, ultimately, this is what we're doing. We're looking for organizations and people who have money to help us support our photography works. So these are all of the various elements that goes into a typical proposal. And again, this is not one size fits all, but this is in my experience of doing for 20 years and being fairly successful with receiving grants. These are generally the things that are going to be expected of you. What I'm going to talk most about is the first one, is the text itself. So that's obviously a very important document. I want to talk a little bit about the pitch. And what I mean by the pitch is sort of that one or two sentence that is able to encapsulate your work. I'm not going to talk about the CV or the portfolio. I think those can be sort of self-explanatory. And if there's time, I can vaguely show you a kind of a budget. But this, I find, is very specific to the funders itself. So, and again, we've only really got an hour, so I'm going to focus on the first two, the text and the pitch, and give you some sort of, I don't know, tools or guidelines or something. But let's begin. So this is a slide. I made this a number of years ago. I just started to think of all of the various places that I've applied for over the years. And there was a long time there where I probably apply for, I don't know, 20 things a year. And if I was lucky, I would get one. So, you know, the odds of that are quite slim. Yet it also means, for me, the question is that you have to kind of consistently and constantly be working on these applications. So the other thing I think is really important, as I said, is like you've got to start this process now if you have not already. One thing that's really important with grants is that every year, generally the people who are going to be assessing those grants, generally it changes. So just because you got rejected this year doesn't necessarily mean it's not a good proposal. It just might mean that it's not the appropriate proposal for them at that time. There are so many other sort of extenuating factors that go into the choices. So for me, it's kind of a question of constantly sort of doing. And the more that you do, the sort of higher the probability or the chances of actually being successful you can attain. And I apologize for my very lame American-centric example here, but just do the math. You know, the greatest baseball player of all time, he does 750 times he gets a home run, but failed to do, though, 12,000 times. So you can easily port that to your own experiences submitting and writing for grants. Frankly, the majority is you're not going to be successful. But if you get one and a half a year, every 2 years, that's actually pretty good because, you know, there is some funding there for you to at least, I don't know, initiate, to carry on, or to finish out a project. Now, these are just super simple tips. I mean, some of these you might think, oh boy, really? We're kind of showing up for the, you know, really? You're telling me to be interesting and not to bore people? But you would be surprised, especially when it comes to grant writing, how sort of boring many proposals can be, because people sort of treat a grant proposal as if it's some kind of administrative object. But in reality, it's a document that is really revealing who you are as a practitioner, what you believe in, what you've done, how do you see the world, and in which ways is photography an integral component to your practice. So that's what I mean by be interesting. It also means like, don't be afraid to take risks in the writing. And I can talk a little bit about that in my own case when I show you a couple of examples, what I mean by that. There's also this tendency, and I certainly see it in university, where we think it sounds better if we have sort of very large words, but little words are fantastic ones, straightforward words, words that you actually know, which brings me to this point about ensure that you're actually using the words that you understand and that you know. I can generally tell when I'm reading a proposal that somebody is perhaps using a larger word that they don't necessarily understand, like I can't even pronounce it, epistemological, like just say to know something, right? Um, and then this to me is also the next one, be yourself. This is super important. Again, one of the major things, kind of a red flag that I see a lot of the times is that you start writing towards the assumptions of what you think the grant is asking for. Now, there's a difference between who, let's say, a funder is. One thing I always will recommend is print it out, get out your highlighter, and look to their mission statement. Who are they? What are they? What do they fund? Who have they fund? What kinds of works are they interested in? So that you have to know. But if you say, look at who the jury is or who the assessing panel is, don't ever try to assume what they want to know. I would say, first and foremost, is be yourself, write to what you know, write to who you know, and that's really allowing yourself to say, come alive on the page. Um, because assumptions will ultimately kill you. And as I said, there are so many external factors that goes into the selection of successful grants. So, for example, it's never, let's just say, the best proposal. That is a thing that doesn't exist. It's sort of a much larger, let's say, cosmology of different actions that need to go in. And just because you weren't successful doesn't make it a bad proposal. I would say take a look at it again, but then over the course of the year, you can edit it and adapt it for the next version. The next part here is, being thoughtful. What I mean by this is who are you as a photographer is essentially what I'm saying here. Um, Not just who are you as a photographer or how are you as a photographer, how do you see the world, what is, say, your visual journey, but also what do you know about the topic? You definitely have to know or share with in the text with the jury that you have put in the effort, you have put in the time, and that you do have a relationship. Doesn't mean you need to be an expert, but you just need to somehow demonstrate that there's a certain particular kind of knowledge that you have. And then the last one for me, this is very important because it's also astounding how many times people sort of refuse to write visually, again, because they think that this is some kind of, I don't know, administrative document that thrives in a bureaucracy. But your photographers write visually. So it doesn't mean you have to literally describe a photograph. And again, I'm going to show you some examples by what I mean by visual writing. But, conjure images in the words itself. So people, you can start to see what it is that you're interested in. For me, when I read a proposal, if images are coming into my head, then to me that's the beginning of a successful proposal because I can start to imagine the possibilities of what this proposal is going to be. Okay, context. This is a super important word. And there's right here, you can have 100 words. So what I mean by context, there's lots of different ways you can go about this. Historical context, your own practice as context. Maybe there's an editorial or a journalistic context. So, i.e., what is the story going on right now? So, how does your work, say, relate to broader issues? Um, Context could also mean what have you done before? How do you sort of see your practice? Where do you think it will be going? So that's what I mean by context. There's all kinds of different ways that you can sort of swirl around this word. But basically, what it means is you're taking yourself and you're putting it in relationship to other ideas and other notions. You're sort of building out a thorough window upon who and what you do. Okay, what happened? Will it happen again? Why should we care? These are not necessarily things that you absolutely have to answer. They're kind of starting points. Treat these sort of as prompts to begin. But frankly, I should say that for me, the third one, why should we care? That to me is a vital thing. If you can make somebody care about what you're doing, invested emotionally, intellectually into your work, then you start to sort of bring the jury along with you. And why should we care, I think, to me is an absolutely vital question. So I say here, you've already got 200 to 300 words. So if you wrote out what happened, that's 100 words. Will it happen again? Yes, no, maybe. These are the circumstances that went into it. I don't know. That's 100 words. Why should we care isn't necessarily, I would say, a paragraph. Why should we care is much more, let's say, following through the entirety of the proposal. This is sort of an implicit rather than an explicit. Also, for me, I think it's very important. Again, these are not rules. These are just suggestions and thoughts to consider. So look for a personal perspective. What brought you to that story? Why are you engaged with it? Why are you the one that feels the necessity to be working on this story? By bringing a personal perspective, it also means that you kind of know what you're talking about. And I said, you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to be a PhD. You don't have to be a New York Times journalist. But what you do have to have is some kind of relationship to the subject matter, to the topic at hand. And then you need to kind of express how you might have some knowledge of this subject. But also a lot of the time, so for example, when I received a Guggenheim, it was sort of at the earlier part of my career, but that proposal was really structured around what I didn't know. And the reason I wrote that proposal was because I wanted to know something even more. And that was how I sort of, yeah, I set up the language like, but I don't know about this. I don't know about this. I've been here. I've done that. But now I really want to know about X, Y, and Z, for example. But that's still sort of expressing that you've got some kind of relationship, almost like a compulsion or a super level engagement to the subject matter at hand. And this to me is also an important one. There's going to be a difference between confidence and arrogance. So you have to watch that. So arrogance is, I already know what I'm doing. Everything's going to be fine. I would say as a jury member, then why are you applying other than just to have money? Um, so confidence, though, also gives me on the jury confidence in you that you're actually going to be able to execute this project. You're actually going to be able to follow through with what you propose. So in this sense, you also have to be very aware of who the funders are, what kinds of projects do they fund, and frankly, you need to find out on average, let's say, how much money they might be offering you, which is usually very common. That's something that the funders are very upfront about. So an example I can give here about achievability of a project. I was on the jury a number of years ago, and there was a project proposal. I vaguely remember it now, but it was about, I think, a series of tributaries in the Amazon River. And the proposal was to sort of investigate, I don't know, like a dozen of these tributaries in the Amazon basin. It was a really lovely written proposal, but the fund was about $20,000, which is still a lot of money, but absolutely not enough to be able to do this massive project. So what I would recommend in that case is you can talk about, let's say, the overall arc of what you envisioned. But for a proposal in this example, it could be, well, now I'm going to look at one specific branch of this river between X and Y, or whatever, this sort of location, or this issue, or this condition. And this, in other words, you can maybe frame it as a chapter within a larger project. And that to me potentially says, okay, this person understands the overall vision of what it is that they're interested in, yet in the same sense, this $20,000, for example, is actually going to be put to use. And at the end of it, there's probably going to be some kind of project that comes out of this. So that's what I mean by confidence and achievability. I should also say I'm obviously speaking very fast, and my English is pretty good. I think it's because I speak it's my first language. So if you do have any questions about my language and such, just feel free to jump in. But again, I think taking screenshots of this will also help you a lot, and it is being recorded. But I just wanted to say I'm kind of moving at a slightly faster pace because of the density of information, and I want to share with you as much as we can in this time. Okay, I believe these are passive words. I can, I will are active words. But as I say here, you don't want to be too confident. Oh, I already know this. I can do it. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. Because as we all know, when you're working on a project, there are so many variables, unpredictable variables that happen that we can't fully ever predict what's going to happen. But you do need to sort of use a set of language, so an active voice rather than a passive voice. So I think maybe that it will kind of, of course, I'm exaggerating, or I believe these are sort of words that communicate to me that, are you really sure about what you're doing here? Because the language that you're using is a little bit, unsure. So try to always go back into your document and kind of look for the active voice. Okay, this is also something very important, and this was said to me a few years ago from the Alexa Foundation, which is, I'm sure, on all of your radars to apply to. She was making the point that it's usually about a topic rather than a proposal. And there's a big difference because a proposal is not just about the story per se, but it's also about, as I said before, the context that this story sits within. Who are you as a photographer? What have you done? What are you doing now? Where would you like to go in your career? Give me maybe, I don't know, historical, economic, social context about the story at hand. Um, Visual references, or let's say if you're going to have specific visual approaches, all of these things go into your document to become a very rich case study about what it is that you're actually going to be doing, how you're going to do it, and why you should be doing that, as opposed to just sort of rambling on about a topic, about just a story idea. That's not a proposal. For me, these are your three best friends. And I like these because you can ask yourself, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? And how do I choose to do that? And right there, you've got 200 words per question. That's 600 words. You're now 2/3 of the way done finishing your application. What have I done? So that's lots of sort of ways to think about that. That's about you as a practitioner, but it's also about what is the story? What are the circumstances? What are the various conditions? Why? Why is this story important? Why should we care? How are you going to approach it? Is there something in particular that you want us to sort of know in terms of, let's say, a visual technique or something like that? I'll go into these now in a little bit more detail. So these are just, again, prompts to kind of get you going. And one thing I would suggest is if you give yourself a series of prompts, just write to the prompts. Don't start writing an application, just write a bunch of words and then vomit it all out on the paper. Then you can go back and you can sort of start editing, picking and choosing certain passages, paragraphs, sentences. But if you ask yourself, like, what will we see? So in this, what I mean is for me as the jury, like, what's there? Um, I was just, before we started, I was just looking at all this amazing footage coming out of Florida about the coming hurricane. So I could imagine, what do we see? Well, there was one amazing photograph, somebody landing on a passenger plane of all the highways, and it was dark, and all you saw were like red brake lights, right? So that's a very sort of visual image. So how do you approach the story? And there's lots of ways to think about this. This is you as a storyteller. So what are the mechanics? How are you going to tell that story? What are some photos we'll see? This is a difficult one because the problem here is people will think, well, I don't know because I haven't done it yet. But I'm not asking you to literally tell me some photos that you see, but conjure certain visual notes. And I'm going to show you some example about what I mean by that. So think about your own work. Think about maybe a story that you've made, and as a good exercise, it's a great way to not necessarily literally explain. This is a photograph of a person sitting in a room on a chair against a white wall. But it could be about it's a series of portraits, and I'll be shooting it in the moonlight, and the skin tones are coming off as some kind of whatever silver. It's a bad example, but I think you get my idea. And then, of course, the visual strategy. So how are you using photography? And this could be very simple. It's a portrait series, it's a reportage, it's documentary. I don't know, I'll be using 3D scanning or LiDAR, or scanning electron microscopes, whatever. I mean, this, though, is really important because how you approach a story is also the way that the story itself can be communicated. Maybe other things to think about. And it's the one example that I'll show you of mine is the last part. Are you doing something different that needs a visual explanation? So for one of my works, I was actually using a scanning electron microscope, a very, 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 very specific set of technologies. And I knew absolutely, I can't just say, oh, and I'm going to use a scanning electron microscope, because the jury would be, wait a second, what, back up. What do you mean? What is a scanning electron? Why are you using them? Do you even have access to such equipment? So that's what I sort of mean here. If you kind of go, let's say, beyond the standards or expectations of what a documentary is, then I do believe you should address that, even if it's a couple of sentences. I think also, again, like bringing yourself into it. So what is something that's personal to you? Why? Because I want to know, like, why you? Why did you come to this story? But also thinking through the audience. What is it that, as I say here, that you hope people will take away from this story? What is it that you want to share? What is the, say, vital part of the story that you're proposing that you feel is necessary for the world to, say, engage with? Okay, now, another side note here, talk to yourself, because writing is a conversation. A lot of the times I read so much stuff, and after 3 sentences, I fall asleep and I don't want to finish it because it is boring and I'm not having a conversation with this text. And writing to me is really a conversation. And I don't know about you, but certainly when I start to maybe get lost in a sentence or not sure what to say, I just start speaking it. I try to finish the sentence out loud. And I always do that. And as soon as I sort of engage that conversational mode, the words sort of flow again. So what I'm also saying here is you also have to see writing as a multiple iterative process. In other words, 1 draft, 2 draft, 3 draft, 4 draft. So you're spitting it out in the first, but by the time you get to the 4th draft, you're really able to be much more precise. And one way that I think is really important, especially in proposal writing, because it really is about you as a storyteller that's bringing something to the table. This is a quote from Sarah Terry, so one of the 7 members, and I'm sure you know about her Aftermath grant. So this is good advice because she's also very successful in her grants. So what she's saying here, is it conversational? And I learned that doing a lot of work in public radio, it actually made my writing better when I went back to sort of doing this writing. So in other words, what she's saying here is, especially at this top, like, I don't know quite how to explain it, but it's a little stiff and way down, and that's not how you are. So how do you translate who you are into words? Well, to me, it's using sort of a conversational tone. All right. So these are like all the very fast, quick facts. It's already 45. I can't believe it. It goes really fast. Okay. I'm now just going to jump ahead, and I'm going to show you one proposal of mine, and we're going to go through it on a line by line basis. So this is a project called War Sand. Here it is. There it is, became a book. Lots of grant money went into this. So what I'm going to show you is a bunch of paragraphs, and I'm going to kind of explain what's happening in each of one of these paragraphs. And the text that I'm going to show you is, it's also, I used it so many times that it slightly changed all the time. But what I'm presenting to you is the very first version. So this is kind of like the core text. And this is also something, as I said before, like why writing is so important is because you can build a core text and then you go back into it and you can slightly adapt it for whichever means you need, but at least you have something. So you don't have to start from zero. So this is how I began. This is the opening sort of paragraph. The idea here is just to kind of hook the viewer, but also goes back to context. So this project was very much about history and a very, very specific part of history. So World War II, but not just World War II, about one day, a 24-hour period called D-Day, June 6, 1944. So I wanted to immediately lead with that. So the jury, they're like, okay, this is, I guess, is going to be a project about D-Day. I have no idea what this guy is going to propose, but at least I know the sort of the location of this work. And then I sort of step back a little bit. So the way that you can think about this paragraph is through the notion, let's just call it background. So again, it's kind of a contextual framing. So also what I'm doing here is I'm kind of setting up, as I said before, for part of this project, I used a scanning electron microscope, which is a big fancy thing that universities own and not many people have access to it. But I had this idea that I wanted to look at the grains of sand through a microscope to kind of ask a simple question: what stories, or does sand hold memory, basically? So what I'm doing here in this paragraph is I'm introducing, we're at a specific moment in time, June 6, 1944. Now I'm sort of looking at the present moment. So talking about all of this war material that is still on the beaches of Normandy today. Shrapnel, bullet casings, armor plates are still there 70 years later, transformed, blah, 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 blah. Now, the key sort of part here is this array of micro artifacts that span between technology and nature. Then I follow up. Archaeologists have said that up to 8% of the sand is made up of this shrapnel. So this is kind of like a fact, but it's not necessarily, as you see, it's not footnoted. It's not the New York Times says or the United Nations report and blah, 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 blah. It's just archaeologists. And sometimes that's okay because you have like only so much space to say. But what I'm trying to say here is like, look, experts have said that this is the case. So therefore, this is where me, the photographer, enter into, is this sort of archaeological notion of what these beaches are. And then the last sentence, wave, storm, rust, wipe this microscopic archaeology, that's also a very key word, in another 100 years. So now what I've done is now I slightly change the tempo, I change the iteration. Why should we care? So what if the beaches is full of a bunch of microscopic shrapnel? But I'm basically saying, well, this sand is a question of memory, and once it goes, does our memory also drift away with it? So kind of trying to balance, like, let's say, a poetic or a philosophical or a dreamlike sort of positioning of something with some practical considerations. And now the third paragraph is, I've explored the new science of archaeological microphotography, which is an appropriate tool, da, 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 da. Then specifically, you'll see here the second sentence. This is very deliberate on my part. The Nadler Institute of Archaeology defines microarchaeology as, and then a quote. So what I wanted to do here is say, look, this notion of microphotography, this idea of looking at sand on a beach, there's nothing new here. What's new about it is that I've chosen to sort of refocus that lens on the remains of a specific battle. So also what I'm trying to say to the jury is, look, I kind of know what I'm talking about. Don't worry. It seems a completely preposterous thing, but This is something that I have access to. And that's what the second paragraph is about. So basically I say, working closely with the Department of Physics at Queen's University in Canada, the project will make use of a scanning electron microscope, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm trying to set up here is to say, here's the idea. I'm going to look at sand in relationship to memory, D-Day, June 6, 1944, but I want to use a very specific technology. I have access to it. It is a thing. It's not a complete sort of left field moment of chaos. It actually occurs. And I would say that this proposal, because not all of us are going to be making photo projects around SEM, scanning electron microscope photography, and I don't think every proposal needs to be sort of so explicit in, say, the technique, but this is a good example of why it's important to sort of point towards that technique and really offer some evidence that it's an achievable thing. So earlier I talked about, execution and achievability. That's ultimately what I'm trying to say here is like, let's just move past it. Everything's hunky-dory. I got it taken care of. Now here is where I changed the tempo a little bit. I'm sort of thinking about the broader implications of why this is important to document micro artifacts. So a series of deep window snapshots to reveal secrets of a tragic and heroic encounter that will soon disappear forever. So basically I'm saying, by using this technology, we can look at microscopic grains of sand to see what sort of histories, what stories are embedded in such microscopic things. Now I completely change tactic because it's still a slightly odd proposal. So now what I'm trying to say is, but this isn't anything new for me as a photographer, because my practice is about the relationship to nature and technology, let's say. And then I say, I've previously created a visual history of violent clashes. That's also very important because basically what I'm saying is I'm interested in the violent alterations of the landscape through technology. And this is just one more body of work in my larger oeuvre as a photographer. So photos from my previous trips to similar sites were made in Russia, in Chernobyl, and Fukushima. So basically what I'm saying is, while this project is slightly different because it's about history and it's about World War II, it still kind of fits within the broader trajectory or box that I sit in as a photographer. So kind of also trying to say like, it's me building out my practice. I've done this, but now I also want to go do this. So really kind of being able to understand who and what you do as a photographer is super important in all proposals. And now I kind of definitely go into a very eggheady sort of trajectory. I'm still sort of talking about the importance of this work. What does it mean to me? How do I sort of relate to it? But what I'm doing here is also kind of making an intellectual leap between what I would like to do, but also the histories of documentary photography, starting in the 19th century, the 1800s, with say Timothy O'Sullivan. So in other words, I'm kind of saying like, Timothy O'Sullivan, his Civil War photography is not much different than the type of photography that I am doing today, 150 so years later. So in other words, I'm kind of trying to place myself within a certain trajectory that, again, that isn't something completely, I'm not out to reinvent anything, but what I am trying to do is look at an oft told story, but in my own sort of particular way and voice. And then it concludes. And basically, I should say, and again, because we've only got an hour and a bit, in this paragraph, I recycled for years because these are very sort of broad, layered notions that are not, I should say, are not necessarily story specific, they're practice specific. So what I mean by that is these two paragraphs are all about the practice that I have, and the various stories that I work on are just smaller pieces of a larger practice. So this, for example, is about the individual piece, as where this is about the broader condition of my practice. So I'm trying to relate the story itself to my broader, who am I and what do I do as a photographer? And then here you can see this is all one piece of paper. And a lot of the times, an A4 sheet, a lot of the times grants will say on one A4 or 8.5 by 11, or maximum 500 words or 750 words. Very, 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 very rarely will the proposal itself be, I mean, the longest one I think I wrote was 1,500 words, and that was for a Guggenheim proposal, but that's still only 3 pages. So when you look at this, it's a ton of information that you can really pack into a sheet. But again, this is also why you really need to start looking at all of the various aspects. It's not always just about the story. It's about how does the story relate to your broader conception of who and what you do as a photographer? How maybe does that story relate to the broader world? Why should we care about that story? How are you going to go about that? So all of these paragraphs are basically individual points. That's essentially what I'm doing here. These are just examples. So this was the base template, and then through this base template, I have 3 examples here. I slightly, would shift things around depending on who the funder was. Maybe I had a different idea at that time, but basically everything is grounded within this section, which then I can sort of slide it around. So for example, if you see this one here, I don't know if you see my mouse cursor or not, but if you see the one on the right, I guess, in this case, I started off with a long quote from Tim O'Brien. It's a book called The Things They Carried About the Vietnam War. So it begins quite differently, and this one's also a little bit more specific. You'll also see the second last and last paragraph are very different than this version. So I've kind of lowered the scanning electron microscope, Queen's University, these last 2 paragraphs. I put it right at the end. I don't quite remember why. This one pretty much follows the pattern before, but there are some slight differences in the middle here. And then a last one, I changed it again. My grandfather liked to tell stories. And then being very sort of explicit. This work examines collective memory surrounding a historical incident that quickly became etched in the annals, da, 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 da. So again, I'm saying the same thing. I'm just doing it in slightly different ways. As you can see also here, the very last paragraph is saying, working closely with the department at Physics, Queen's University, etc. Just trying to say, like, I got this covered. So this is kind of a typical proposal. It's kind of a typical length. As I said, some can be a little bit longer. This is probably about 500 to 600 words. So again, it's really not a lot of time. So that is one proposal, and I'm sorry, but that's the only time we have to go through one proposal. Normally, I do a workshop and we go through multiple proposals of mine and others, but I think this should give you a sort of indication of different ways that you can approach it as well. That's also, I think, very important, is that you have to start thinking about the structure, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but start thinking about the narrative of the proposal itself. So not just the narrative of the story of your of the thing that you would like to get funded, but think about this document and what the narrative arc is. That where do I begin, what happens in the middle, and how do I end this thing? And so you kind of start thinking as a photographer, right? You're starting to think structurally. In a way, it's sort of just like picture editing. How do I open a story? What happens in the middle of the story? What are the key points that I want to address? And then how do I end it? So you need to adapt that thinking into the proposal itself, which is why I sort of am showing this with opening, background, precedent. It's me sort of not just thinking about what I'm writing, but in which order, where's the information going to come? What's the most important thing to say now at this point? But we're going to completely switch gears and sort of in a way, start to conclude it. For me, this is super important. I call it a pitch. And I think this is a fantastic quote about what a pitch is. This has nothing to do with photography. This is from a book agent. But basically, if you can't describe a book in one or two pithy sentences, so nice, short, sharp sentences that would make you or your mother want to read it, then of course you can't sell it. This was also Sarah Terry's advice. I don't know if you noticed that, but back in that one slide where I was showing you Sarah's comments, she's like, what would you say to your grandmother what your work is about? How do you communicate to, say, the person on the street, your neighbor, your friend, etc. So basically what a pitch is, it encapsulates all of the information. It encapsulates the story in two sentences, basically. And the reason I want to talk about this is twofold. First, pretty much 98% of the grants, they ask you for one sentence, 45 words, for example, maximum 50 words, maximum 25 words. State your project in a sentence. But I also found that a pitch is super important in general. I've used it so many times, and there was one moment years ago, I was sitting in the offices of Newsweek, and I was meeting with a photo editor in her sort of cubicle, and her email screen was up, and literally almost every second it was going ding, 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 and she kept sort of looking at it and just deleting, delete, 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 delete. I'm like, oh, what is going on? She's like, oh, I get so much mail. And then we sort of started to talk. She's like, but what strikes me is the subject line of an email. So if there's something that I feel I want to sort of dig into, then I won't delete that message. So the other way to think about a pitch is just to kind of, it's a way to sort of hook somebody. It's a way to sort of not solve all of the questions, but at least to kind of get them interested. And all, frankly, you want somebody to say to you is, oh, tell me more. That's all that a pitch is. So you kind of hook them, they're intrigued, and then the opportunity to sort of really share that project proposal with them happens. So just a couple of little tips about writing a strong pitch line. Don't try to tell the whole story, which is really difficult. It's about an emotional sort of resonance. Also, it's trying to learn to communicate between the lines, so not necessarily having to say it. So a pitch is also very much implicit rather than explicit. So as I said before, it's a taste of what's to come. It's just the thing to sort of go, okay, very interesting. So I'm going to show you, I don't know, 2 or 3 examples, very different examples. This one from probably one of the greatest pitchmen of all time. Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world? So what's happening here, there's lots. There's all kinds of tensions that are playing off of one another. Sugar water is just some derivative, just something, but changing the world is the most massive thing anybody can do, right? So there's tension between selling sugar water, which is a joke, or changing the world. So what do we mean by sugar water? Well, who is it? Steve Jobs, of course. This was his pitch line back in the 80s to some guy who was the ex-CEO of the Pepsi-Cola Corporation to come run Apple Computer for him. So instead of saying, would you like to leave your job at the Pepsi-Cola Corporation and join us at the Apple Computers Corporation? No, that's not very interesting. This is like, oh, okay, tell me more. Another way to think about it is all the time in filmmaking, documentary, television, etc., you really have to be able to state your purpose in a sentence. And this is going back to this slide here. You cannot tell the whole story, but it also means you really need to know what the story is about. So when you read this one, a young man and woman from different social classes fall in love aboard an ill-fated voyage at sea. Maybe some of you will know it. Maybe I'm also dating myself a little bit, but it is Titanic, Rose and Jack, Leo and Kate Winslet. Most people think, yeah, but why isn't Titanic in here? This is a great example where Titanic is not the story. The story is about love, and it's about this ill-fated voyage at sea. So you could update this story, for example, in a completely different, say, voyage at sea. So Titanic is just a vehicle that the story gets told, but that's secondary. That's the second layer of where this story happens. The most important one is that it's a love story. It's ill-fated, so in other words, something's going to happen. So it's a tragedy. That is, I think, a good example of how you can sort of strip down something to its very core essentials. This one I like to show because this is Walter White, you know, from Breaking Bad, and this is how the creator, Vince Gilligan, pitched it to the studio executives. And most people also confuse. They say, oh, it's about a guy who becomes a meth dealer because he has cancer and he needs to raise money, whatever. But this is how Vince Gilligan, the creator of it, he said, simply, it's a story of the transition from good to evil. How does this man go from good to being an evil man? It doesn't matter what he does to become evil. That's what the whole thing is about. But ultimately, the essence of this is simply this. It's a transition from good to evil. Another example, and this is also from the same Breaking Bad, and it's a little bit specific because it's a culturally specific thing. But the reason I bring up this is because what Vince Gilligan is doing, he's talking visually. So he's implanting into your brain images that most can sort of compute, but he also knows his audience. So he's talking to studio executives who know who Mr. Chips is. So for example, Mr. Chips was in the United Kingdom like the most kindest, greatest, gentlest teacher of all time. And I think most of us know who Scarface is, a horrible monster, right? So basically what Gilligan is saying, he's giving you images. So how does this kindly gentleman become this sort of psychopath? It's a story from good to evil. So that's also the importance of being able to think visually and let the visuals themselves do all of the heavy lifting, basically. Let the pictures themselves sort of really give you the words that you have very little space to use. The last example here, the 2014 Winter Olympics are being organized in a subtropical conflict zone. This one to me is a great example of allowing everything to be said between the words themselves. So this is from Rob Hornstra's Sochi project. So what's happening here is we have winter, subtropical, Olympics, conflict zone. And I think why this one works so well, as I said before, is because you've got these tensions between, well, wait a second, winter and how can a Winter Olympics be in a subtropical zone? Or wait, aren't the Olympics all about so-called peace, love, and understanding? But now we've got a conflict zone. What is this project all about? And then this would be the example of like the follow-up. So the great thing with a pitch is you can go, boom, you drop it. Hopefully somebody says, oh, tell me more. And now you can sort of get into the sort of unfolding of this project. So this is the example of the next, say, layer of what you should have, say, when you're constructing such pitches, and being able to articulate in a very like brief paragraph all of the necessary information that needs to be included. Okay. I like these little sort of side notes. This is more about writing. For me, one thing I would highly recommend is including questions in your text. What I like about questions in text is that it gives me, the reader, agency. It's almost like having a conversation with the writer. So when you're asking questions, not too often, maybe once, maybe twice in your text, you sort of are throwing it over to who's ever reading your document to kind of go, oh, I don't know, I disagree about that, or that's an interesting prompt. Let me think about that. So in other words, you're sort of like initiating a conversation. And that's why I really like to have questions in the text itself. So ask something. What do you think about X? What do you think about Y? That way you become, or you allow the reader to become a little bit more invested in what and how you're saying. Now I'm going to show you some ancient examples, but to me they're kind of interesting because of their, let's say, almost, I don't know, bravado or structural sort of bravery. So this is from Gary Winogrand. This is, of course, 60 years ago, so it's quite old. So, of course, the language is very dated. But basically, what Winogrand is writing here, he's saying, everything sucks. The word, they all deal in illusions and fantasies. I can only conclude that we've lost ourselves and the bomb may finish the job permanently. It just doesn't matter. We have not loved life. I mean, poor Gary here is just having a very difficult time, basically saying everything is garbage, everything is ruined. What am I going to do? And at the very end, and this is the second last paragraph of the text, and the very last sentence, he says this: but I cannot connect or accept my conclusions, and so I must continue this photographic investigation and deeper. This is my project. So basically what Winogrand is saying here is blah, 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 oh my gosh, things are terrible. But he says, but wait a second, that's not true. What is positive or what is good out there? That is the project. So basically, again, this is an example of like being able to say things without being able to write it specifically, or using language in a way that communicates beyond just what the words themselves mean. And this, to me, I think, as I said, I think it takes a lot of bravery to sort of completely throw out the window what you just said. But this is also what I find fascinating about this one. There's almost like a compulsion here. He's got such a desire to go, but I cannot accept this. Therefore, I need to go out as a photographer and I need to know more. Why do I think this world is like this in such a way? Well, let's go find out. So in other words, can you please sign the check and send me on my way so we don't have to say live in such a world? So as I talked before about this notion of writing visual, you are visual, so please write visually. As I said before, it's shocking how many proposals are almost anti-visual. And I said, it's not about describing actual specific photographs, but it's kind of conjuring a world. Where does this place come from? What kinds of scenarios can we imagine? How and what are your photographs? And as I said here, you are proposing a photography project, which is comprised of photographs. And if you're not able to really sort of conjure a visual world in your text, then I also don't think you'll really be able to conjure a visual world even in your own photography. So here's an example of how you can be very precise. You don't have to go in depth with a lot of things. You can just very quickly almost skirt by it. This paragraph is a beautifully visual rendering of a time and of a space. So here we have a town at night, a parking lot, a supermarket, a highway. Those first ones, they're very straightforward. Oh, I can picture a town at night. I can see what a parking lot looked like. I know what a supermarket is. I see a highway. But then it slightly changes, right? The man who owns 3 cars and the man who owns none. So yes, there might be a literal photograph of a man standing beside 3 cars, or there might be a literal photograph of a man with no cars, but ultimately that's not what the photographs are. In this case, the man who owns 3 cars and the man who owns none, this is about inequality. This is about wealth distribution. That's really what the heart of this is. The farmer and his children, a new house and a warped clapboard house, the dictation of taste, the dream of grandeur, advertising, neon lights, the faces of the leaders and the faces of the followers, gas tanks and post offices and backyards. So to me, that's a wonderful sort of encapsulation of the potentials of what kind of photography project is, or this one is going to be. And of course, it's probably one of the most famous photo books of all time. That is from Robert Frank's The Americans proposal. And of course, as we're able to sort of look back on Frank's Americans, you really do sort of see this kind of unfolding of an American portrait through a whole display of various different aspects of things. So I think this is a great example of what I mean by visual writing. So the man who owns 3 cars, the man who owns a new house and a warped clapboard house. Again, I don't think we have to take it literally. Oh, I'm going to make a picture of a new house and an old house. It's really about sort of using the visual grammar, the visual language, to really manifest the potentials of what you, as the photographer, will be seeing. Okay, I'm just going to sort of wrap up here. This is a fantastic book. It's all about writing and the writing process. There are a million great tips in here. I highly recommend. You can get it as an e-reader. It's an easy read. John McPhee is a writer for The New Yorker, wonderful writer, and this book is fantastic if you're interested in writing. I'm not going to go too much into this because we don't necessarily have time, but this is coming from John McPhee's book. I kind of mentioned it earlier when I was showing you how I broke down my own proposal of war sand. But basically what McPhee is asking you to do is before you even start is to sort of think diagrammatically, structurally. How do I want this text to sort of unfold? How am I going to say, frame this work? So for example, I'll just talk about this one. This was a New Yorker article. It was all about the city of Atlanta and how it was growing so big and how certain kinds of wildlife were sort of under threat from the suburbanization of Atlanta. But he's like, well, how am I going to start this story? Like, what am I going to do? How am I going to structure this? So his diagram is, well, I'm going to tell a story about a turtle that I saw. And I start writing about that turtle, and then I write more like scientific, ecological, environmental text about stream channelization, ecological policy, etc. And then the story starts to unfold, and you have Atlanta sort of here on the side. So what he's saying here is this is a story about the suburbs of Atlanta. So we're not talking about the city itself, but we're talking about the edge of Atlanta. So I need to make sure in my text that I don't talk about Atlanta specifically from an urban point of view, but I talk about Atlanta from its edge. And then again, a weasel, a rattlesnake, a muskrat, etc. So he's using these sort of animals as kind of drop-in points. And in between those drop-in points become, let's say, the more scientific or ecological structures. So thinking structurally is a vital aspect. And once you have, say, your structure down, you can easily just start writing. Okay, oh, that's right. Now I just need to write about the turtle. Now I need to write about this. Now I need to write about that. And boom, you're done. Okay, I think I'll take 5 minutes because everybody always asks me about budgets. I don't want to get into too complex detail because most places, actually, I'm going to go to this one. Most places have their own kind of budget forms. But I just kind of want to draw here is like, as you see from this example, you don't need to be too specific. It's kind of specific. And all you're doing is getting an indication of how much money you think you might need, but a realistic number. So you do have to do your research. So what you see here, this is for the Canada Council for the Arts. So this is more of an arts-based rather than a journalistic one. And I'll show you, yeah. So basically a budget, in this case, it's broken up into two major categories. So at the top, you have the expenses. So how much is this project going to cost? But then you also have revenues. So are you going to bring any money to this proposal? So I'll just quickly go through expenses. So some grants, at least this one, they will give you money for subsistence. So basically what that means is since you're not going to be working, we're going to kind of it's like a wage. And here they say you can get up to $2,000 per month. So this grant is for $20,000. I figured, okay, I think, yeah, it'll probably take me 5 months to start off this project. I need to live. I still need to pay my rent. So I'll do the maximum. I don't know why you wouldn't put 2,000. So let's do that. This is not an artist residency, zero. I have no professional development costs. I don't even know what that means, zero. Studio rental and small equipment costs. I'll show you that in a second. Technical services and other related costs, other, specify. You can see how sort of vague this is, right? But that's very common. At least that's in my experience. They don't want to know how many pencils you're going to be buying. They just need to get an indication that your $20,000 budget, for example, that we might potentially give you is realistic. So travel costs, material costs. Material is like, in my case, I was shooting film, so that's obviously a material cost. I need flights, I need hotel, all that kind of stuff. So that's what goes into your expenses. And then you have the revenue, at least in this case. Revenue means, are you going to make any money? So I thought, well, maybe my gallery and my agency, seven at the time, will sell some photographs and it might be this amount of money. So I'm asking for $20,000, but I also know that this project's going to cost me $24,745. So basically what I'm saying here is, don't worry, I've got all the finances secured. You're going to give me 20. I'm going to sell some prints to magazines and to galleries. I'm going to make 5,000, almost $5,000, and that's going to cover the total cost of the project. And then here I kind of just listed, so this was a proposal I did in Lebanon a number of years ago. So it's about, just showing what kind of equipment, I'm shooting film. It's 4x5 sheet film. I need batteries. I need this, that, that, all that kind of stuff. But you don't have to get, I would say this is almost too much information. Here's a very sort of typical this was actually for the very first grant that I got for that war sand project, the one that I showed you. They didn't even have a form. They just said, kind of, how much money do you need? So this was 8,500 euros that I asked for. So I did my research. I was living in San Francisco at the time. So what's a flight? I'm gonna have to rent a car because I need to drive around. Well, I need to stay in a hotel. I'm gonna probably stay in Normandy. So this is how much a hotel is. I gotta eat. Maybe I need a tour guide or some other kind of unknowns. And then, of course, I need to spend some money for this scanning electron microscope, etc. So this is also very, very standard, a very generic sort of thing. So as you can see, it's not necessary to go like too in depth with the uh, um, with the budget. So I think what's best now, because it's already an hour and 20 minutes, that I'm going to stop because the next section was about the CV and the portfolio, but that's pretty straightforward. And you can always ask me questions. You can certainly ask me questions about the budget stuff as well. So yeah, that is a whirlwind of a tour through grant writing. So hopefully I didn't scare you off, but now I stop my screen. And yes,
Thank you,
we
Donald.
go into questions. Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually the first session we had on grant writing was with Sarah Terry, so it's so good you referenced her.
Yeah.
And also for budgeting, I just want to alert everyone that I just posted a link because we had a workshop in March. And there you made a great introduction as well. And then in the workshop, we had it explained more in details how to do the budget, also how to do personal finances and everything. So I think that will be very insightful as well. But yeah, thank you for this very compact introduction to grant writing. I think was super insightful. So if you agree, we would just head to the questions. We had two, now there's three. I answered a few that were more technical already in between. But now going to the first question we had from Joseph was if there's a larger project that you want to do, that a single grant won't fund, is there an issue with getting multiple grants? Should you mention that you need other grants in your proposal?
Okay, yeah, I'm also going to read that. So if there's a larger project you want to do, a single grant won't fund. Is there an issue with getting? No, 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 no. The grants don't have any sort of like proprietary right over your work. Now, what does sometimes happen, but not all the time, generally what my experience is, two things sort of happen. At least like the expectations from, let's say you get the money. And what does the funder want out of it? Usually one of two things. One is, let's say, a set of prints. So like Guggenheim Foundation, they want prints. Just like Duke University funded me for something, they wanted prints. Fine, that's an easy one. The other ones, the more, let's say, larger ones, like the more governmental related ones, they want to report. So basically, you don't even have to show anything. You just write a report. What did I do? Why did I do it? What worked? What didn't work? Was it successful? Was it not successful? It can be not successful. So actually, the budget that I was showing you for this trip to Lebanon was an utter terrible terrible disaster. It did nothing work, camera broke, all this stuff, terrible. But so I wrote all that in the report. But what I did say is that's when I went, oh, wait a second. I think I really like landscape as a sort of genre, as a way of being a photographer. So that in a way, it was a great trip. So I didn't necessarily execute the project that I made, but I came out of that with a heck of a lot of knowledge about what kind of photographer I wanted to be. So just going back to your larger thing, and I also know many people who have been funded. So, for example, this War Sand project was funded multiple times. I think, by the way, a tip: always go to the back of a photo book and look for the logos, because the logos are your best friend. Because that basically, that's the first thing I do. I go to the back page and say, well, how did this project get funded? So here's a whole list of the different organizations that funded me. And generally it's okay because different funders have different needs. And yeah, so they don't own any sort of proprietary. Now, the thing would be, I don't think I would apply with wars. So one of the grants I got was the Canada Council. I'm not going to apply with this project again the next year for Warsan because I already got it for Warsan. I would apply with something else though, and I've done that multiple times.
But then in terms of if you have a larger project, there's no issues with having it funded by different
No.
friends. I think it's we know this kind of projects. Sometimes it's to start this project. Sometimes you get an extra fund from somewhere else to finish it. Sometimes they then support the book, and as you say, then you just acknowledge everyone that supported this kind of project.
Yeah, and I think also the point that I would also want to stress again was that example about the Amazon River tributary project, like being really, you don't have to say I'm working on this huge project about the Amazon River basin. You could just say I'm interested in this one, say, branch of the river. But sometimes it's kind of nice to share like how you understand the various pieces of this thing, of how it kind of goes together. I wouldn't even mention though, I'm applying for a fund for a different part of this project. Like that's unnecessary information. So just kind of only be precise to whomever the funder is. So I'm working on this project. It's about a larger project, and I want $20,000 from you for this specific part of the project. Done. Don't say anything about I'm also applying to X, Y, and Z. It doesn't matter.
Okay, then already during your presentation of different versions of War Sand, Anastas had a question. Which version of the proposals you showed us was funded?
All of them.
All of them.
Yeah. Yeah. So I got, with this project, it was quite successful. I got 5 separate funds. And I wrote 4 different versions. So only one application was the exact same. And the reason they're slightly different is because some, as I said before, you should understand who the funder is. So for example, like Alexia, I don't know if Getty's still doing, but let's say a more photojournalistic type of grant, they don't really care about you, they care about the story. They're interested in the story itself. So it's not going to be so much, well, if I do this, my career will become whatever, blah, blah, blah. Now, the other way to look at it, like a Guggenheim Foundation or the Canada Council for the Arts in my case, or wherever these more, let's say, government type grants, they're not so interested in the work itself. They're interested in you and your practice. So usually what it is an artist, a photographer, somebody needs time. And basically what some of these funders are doing is they're giving you money in lieu of time. So now you can actually go off and do the thing that you want to do. So that's why with Warsan, I was applying to different types of fund. So one of them was a funder in France in that region in Normandy. So I wanted to talk about Normandy. Another one was the Canada Council for the Arts, and it was about me as a practitioner with an interesting idea, but like a mid-career artist who says, I'm interested in this. And then 2 other funds was more story-based. So that's why each of the different proposals have slightly different versions to them, because I'm also investigating and understanding like who exactly is this funder and what are they looking for.
Okay, thank you for this. Then we have Sayan asking, if I promise 10 video interviews as part of offering besides photography for a grant proposal, is it okay to make only 7 video interviews? Can we alter promised offerings?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, in this case, I would say you're almost being way too specific. So 10. I probably wouldn't say 10, or at least I would maybe frame it slightly like I propose a set of multiple interviews. Well, I don't know, or of course, just coming off the top of my head, so don't please write this down. But like, yeah, because every project, regardless of who you are and what you're working on, always undergoes some kind of change in the making itself. There are so many different circumstances that arise. But this is why, again, you have to be very careful about who are you applying and what are their expectations. So, for example, Sarah Terry's grant, the Aftermath, that is a project-based grant. And what they're asking is really they expect a body of work to come out of that. They don't expect a full promise of what you went in with, but you should be within proximity to what it is that you're actually proposing. So if you're going to propose a project about, oh yeah, using sand and microscopes and World War II, you should probably deliver a project about sand, microscopes, and World War II, but you don't necessarily have to literally articulate what that project is going to be in the proposal. So I don't know if I'm being clear there, because there is a fine balance between being able to communicate that you see a vision, you know what you're talking about, yet in the same sense, you are allowing some flexibility because it's impossible to know if I'll get 10 or 7 or 8 interviews. But I would say the most important thing in this example is that you're going to be doing video interviews of more than one person, a multiple set of people. Why is that important? How do you see these interviews integrating into the broader project, et cetera, et cetera? So when you deliver 7 and 10, it doesn't matter. The point being is that you sort of are understanding the idea that all these interviews need to be done.
Yeah, I just want to add also, because I've been working a lot in Creative Europe funds for 7 years, and I had many projects where it was not as it was initially applied for, because also let's say we had projects for 3 years, the availability of artists or people that do the program changes. So there are always possible sometimes adaptations, right, Donald? So I think as long as the project's core stays the same, slight
Yeah.
variations are always kind of possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like a really kind of corny analogy I can make is we all have bodies, but our clothes change day-to-day basis, you know? Like I'm gonna wear maybe not this tomorrow, but a sweater, but I'm still wearing something, you know what I mean? So it's really about understanding scaffolding and how that scaffolding sort of comes to be. But that's why you do need to think about structure. You need to think about that. What is the infrastructure of this project? What's the overall sort of large vision that I have for it?
Yeah, and then let's go to the question from Justin. So he's saying that there are times when specific headings are not covered in some funding programs. So if you don't have any other sponsorship, how to manage in that context? So if I'm understanding correctly, that let's say a big part of the project is not funded, maybe just a part of the project is funded, then how to manage that?
Hmm. Okay, yeah, I'm also trying to wrap my head a little bit. So yeah, so the understanding is you've got a large project, but only maybe a portion of it has been funded. And there's no necessarily sponsorship. I, in a way, I can't really answer that question because, well, I can slightly reframe it. So one of the ways that one of the reasons I really got into grant writing was, yes, as I said before, there's nothing better than getting a nice check and off you go to write. But most importantly is I started to develop a writing practice, and through that writing practice, I was able to articulate who and what I am as a photographer and how I want to go about doing that. And what I realized with a lot of grants, it's sort of a passive thing. They put out a call and we apply. But what would happen if I already know what kind of work I want to do and I approached somebody and said, hey, knocking on a door, this is who I am, this is who you are. Is there some way that we could perhaps work together? So I would say there's never not sponsorship. There might be no sponsorship from Getty or from Guggenheim or the Canada Council for the Arts, but there will always be some kind of, let's say, relationship that you have to go find. And one of the ways that you do that is you really start developing a writing practice. So you're able to say, this is my work, this is what it's about, this is why we should work together. So, for example, like Warsand, with the Queen's University with the microscope, like I was like, how the hell am I going to get a microscope? I don't know. So I already had a one-page proposal, the one that I showed you, kind of done. And I just said to them, you're interested in surfaces and microscopic imagery. I'm interested in history. Don't these worlds collide? And luckily, the professor who's leading that department said, oh, whoa, very interesting for us. This is something new. Yes, let's do something together. And that's also how I got not a lot of money, but they did sort of, well, actually, they offered up their entire facility, so quite a lot of money. So in other words, what I would say is, yes, there will always be no funding, but if you're able to understand who and what you are as a photographer, what your work is really about at its core, at its basic, and you're able to understand other organizations and the role of photography and why photography might say be something for them, then there's funding. Absolutely. That I will stake into the ground and claim.
Yeah, because I remember I listened to your interview that you gave as head of, I think you were head of jury at World Press, right?
Yeah,
It's really, yeah, the people finding their kind of vision and who they are and what they represent. And I think all this should be presented in the proposal. And I think a lot of the alumni that we have here were taught on writing. So I think we had a writing workshop as well last, I think, November. And really, I think also our advice would be write as much as you can. Also to improve on writing, because obviously you are all very visual, but
yeah.
you need to send something out to when you send the pictures, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of also why I think it's really important. Like, I'm not a writer. I don't want to be a writer, but it's a necessity. And one thing I did learn, and the advice that I would give you is you have to allow yourself to be yourself through whatever it is that you write. But also I find like there's something engaging if I'm able to really see the person in the text itself. So to kind of build out a relationship of yeah, of yourself. Like, so it's not sort of disguised under ridiculous words and rhetoric and assumptions and all of that, because that just gets thrown off immediately into the reject pile. But if the writing is, clunky and a little bit bad, but it's very personal and it's heartfelt, and you really sense that this person is committed to the work, that one is going to rise. Absolutely, for sure.
Then we have Cyan asking how to find grant opportunities that do not have open calls. Are
Mm,
there organizations who are not into visual storytelling but can still fund photographic projects?
sure. Why not? um, This is a question where you're going to have to understand what photography can do and why photography is important and why have you chosen photography as the specific medium. But it's not always about photography, especially, let's say, documentary, editorial, journalistic, whatever. It's about audiences and in which ways can an audience engage with a subject matter. So in a way, I would slightly frame it that it's not necessarily about, I'm not coming to you with a photography project. I'm coming to you with a project that I can help you um, attain eyeballs. I can have people engage with your subject matter. Oh, and by the way, we're going to do it photographically. So there is a slight difference there. There was a project at my ex-university where we collaborated with a Dutch law institute, and they were sort of like mediators of environmental malpractice. So they weren't plus or minus, right? They were neutral. Um, and their job was as lawyers to kind of consult both sides, which is a really kind of complex thing about environmental issues. But they came to us because they realized, well, we're not so interested in photography, but we are interested in the way that you understand photography as a communicative medium. And we're about to celebrate our 25th or 40th, I forget, anniversary. And we want to sort of share with the Dutch population what kind of activities we get up to, because generally people don't know what we're doing. You know, so in that is sense, that's kind of an example of just, you know, you just slightly are reframing certain things. But ultimately, I would say anybody who's giving you money has a reason, not just to give money away, but because they think something's important. So you need to figure out what is important to them and how can you actually help them push that importance into the world.
Thank you, Donald. Okay, we have another question. I just wanted to say we have no more questions. So anonymous attendee writes, "Hi Donald, thank you so much for informative presentations. Do you have tips for writing a grant proposal for a research towards the project when we do not have a story yet?"
Yeah, yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of different funds that actually, so for example, the Canada Council sort of has three different types of grants. They keep changing the terminology, so I'm going to get it wrong. But for example, there'll be like a research grant, a research and something grant, then a production grant, and then a distribution grant. And they're kind of three different things. So for example, a research grant is exactly that, like to go out and research project. So you obviously have to come with something in mind and a plan of what it is that you're choosing to investigate and why you want to go about doing this, how you're going to whom will you go speak. Those ones usually become a little bit more specific. Then, of course, the production grant is exactly that. And okay, then there's a little bit different. So with production grant, it could be a work in progress or a work just started or a work about to be finished. So three maybe phases. Sometimes they don't care. Sometimes they do care. I know I always get mad whenever I talk to Sarah because I was shortlisted twice for the Aftermath grant. One year I didn't get it because it wasn't started yet, but then the next time I was shortlisted, it was already started. So, you know, who knows what that actually means. And then, of course, the third kind of grant is like a distribution grant, which is the work definitely has to be done, but now you want to, I don't know, it's more about than just exhibitions, but like engagement, audience engagement. How do you choose to like disseminate, say, that project? Um, so yeah, there's actually quite a few of grants that are available towards research, but I would say the last part of that question, when you say when we do not have a story yet, I would say that's not true. I would say what you're doing is researching into the story to know more about it. So you definitely have to have some kind of uh, um, proposal in mind. But since it's research going into the building out of what the potential of that project could be.
Okay, then we have another question from Lilith that has a concrete story in mind already. So the question goes, I'm starting to work on a video photo project about the refugee community in Portugal. The project is in its pre-production stage and we are brainstorming various opportunities for funding. I'm very new to this field and I wonder how I should approach this.
Yeah. Well, film is a whole other beast. I see that it's a film and photo project. Film is a whole other world, and I would say there's a heck of a lot more funding opportunities in the film world than there is, let's say, in the artistic or photo world. So maybe something to think about there is what relationship between videography or filmmaking and photography has. Are they necessary to say in proposals to be intertwined? Is this something that you could maybe sort of sever for a certain funder? So example, just looking at like pre-production, there's all kinds of pre-production funds for various types of films. But then another way to think about it is, okay, you've got Portugal, you've got refugee communities. There are all kinds of NGOs that are working with various types of stories on refugees and migration. So another way to look at it be I'm not giving you anything concrete, but just kind of like making up imaginary scenario. But for example, let's say there's an organization in Portugal that is, I don't know, like medical based, and they provide medical care to refugees. Okay, yeah, but my work isn't about doctors giving medical treatment, nurses to refugees. No, but this could be an organization, A, where you can start to get access, but also start to build out a specific part of that project, for example. So I'm just, again, I'm just kind of coming up with the stuff off the top of my head. Um, and then, of course, Portugal, I don't know what the Portuguese government thinks about refugees and migration, but it's probably not good because this is Europe in 2024. But there are certain kinds of organizations that might sort of look at things from a policy point of view. So that's kind of going back to the earlier point where I was saying, like, don't necessarily always see it as, well, this is a film or this is a photo project. See it as, this is an issue that I'm interested in. And by the way that I approach that issue is through a specific medium, i.e. photography or film. So trying to really understand, well, what is the work about and how do I do it can be, yes, absolutely integral, yet you can also sort of sever them or you flip them around, right? So you say, this is about refugee communities in Portugal. The carrier of that is, let's say, visual media. Um, so in that sense, your opportunities do open up a lot more, because if it's about issue-based or policy-based or some kind of social issue or cause, people want to communicate what they feel is important, and your role as a communicator then becomes valuable or beneficial. Now, pre-production is always really difficult. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is a longer conversation, but the photos, projects in pre-production stage, brainstorm. Okay, well, and then, as I said, there's all kinds of funding, especially in the film. There's no funding for pre-production. Well, I shouldn't say there's no funding photographically. It's very difficult funding to get research-based grants for a project, because those are usually mostly coming through governmental agencies, such as, say, various EU, like Creative Europe, but that's a very difficult thing, or through your, I don't know, whatever country you come from. Maybe they have some kind of funding. That's usually where research grants come from. It's like kind of a government thing. And then there's all kinds of funding for films themselves, in specifically pre-production, first-time filmmakers, minority filmmakers, women film, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole slew of things you could go out there. Lastly, I'll say to that, producers, that's also what a producer does. If you're maybe able to find somebody who's interested in your topic or who has some kind of connection to the film world, they can act as a producer. And frankly, what their job is to actually go find money for you. And then my last point is, it doesn't always have to be $50,000, $20,000. Sometimes, well, there's two things. Sometimes would rather give you $100,000 than $2,000, but it's also the flip side of things. There's also lots of little tiny funds that you could go after, that, and then you add them all up and it comes to 20,000. So yeah.
Yeah, here, Lilith, I'll leave you my email from the community. I lived in Lisbon for 6 years, so I actually attended quite a lot of events with this topic, and I do know 2 or 3 places where you can start. So just contact me and we can check that together. Then I think, yeah, we have maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes left max. So if there's any additional questions, there are. So there's another one, Donald. So do fund providers also expect us to share detailed balance sheet of expenses?
No. No. Again, this is where things start to get a little bit murky. So, for example, I did 3 projects with an organization called the Canadian International Development Organization, which is a governmental organization. And they literally wanted me to know how many pencils I used. And I put into the budget, I think I bought a pack of pencils and I only used like 2 pencils and I had to reimburse them, $3.52. That was one of the worst projects of my life because it was so focused. But that's very different because it's a huge government agency. It's for a very specific project. It's taxpayer money, all of this kind of thing. So yes, there can be detailed, but it also depends on who that funder is. What we've been talking about today, the general, and I use that very loosely, like arts-based funding, places like Sarah Terry and the Aftermath Grant, these kinds of places. Alexia, no, they don't expect that at all. What they do expect is a realistic budget. If I had put San Francisco to Beirut flight 150 euros, they would be like, this guy out of his mind. Or hotel in Normandy, 1,000 euros a night, they'd be like, this guy's an idiot. We're not giving it to him, no matter how good this project is. So really what the budget is a kind of giving an indication that you know what you're talking about. You have a sense of the achievability of the project, but no, it's not specifically line by line item, unless like um, um, Creative Council of Europe or these kinds of large governmental organizations, yeah, you probably might have to have a line by line accounting. But what we're talking about, those are more rare. And frankly, what I ended up doing for my last one, because it was such a pain, you just hire somebody who you put that into the budget and they take care of everything.
Yeah, that's very true. EU is very detailed, but usually it's good to have an accountant, but this, I think it's much larger grant, so yes. We had that one answered. I saw that someone just asked if there is a list of grants and opportunities. Actually, in each first Wednesday of the month, we have a community hangout where we talk about either a certain topic or have community open hours. So last week we published a new resource, which is a list of grants, awards, and festivals. So I'm gonna add it here. To those that cannot access it, it's under login only because only the members of the community have access to our library. So in case you cannot access it, please send me an email to community at 7 Academy, the email I also published 5 minutes ago, and I'll either reset your password or yeah, we can solve if you have any challenges. How to get access, okay, to previous talks related to writing and grant making. From Sarah, we don't have the talk published, so it was a one-time talk. So that one you cannot find. But I would also say that a lot of you, I think, Donald, a lot of you photographers give interviews, maybe some resources, some of your talks are also available online. So I would say research a lot as well on YouTube, on Vimeo. I think there's a lot of resources also available if you just search a little bit for them. And in the community, we have, I think, over 500 videos now available. So from 7 Insiders, 7 Community, and our partners at PhotoWings. So you have a huge library. You can search by topic. So yeah, if you don't know where to start, you can just ask me for a 5-10 minute introduction to our library, and I'm happy to jump on a Zoom call. Okay, so I think let's take the last question from another anonymous. And the question goes, do grants are specific? Are grants country specific, as most of them are for the stories based on the Western countries, unlike Southeast Asia, where we have fewer opportunities?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You're definitely at a much more of a disadvantage than I am in terms of funding. And that's frankly a part of the dirty secret of the whole funding universe is those who have excess are the ones who obviously um, can have it. That being said, like this is when my advice comes to don't worry about let's say the country specific grants per se, but this is why you really do need to start building out your writing practice, to start writing about what you do, why you do it, how you do it, what is your work about, blah, 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 blah. Because there are institutions, organizations, funders, etc., uh, wherever you are, that, as I said before, it's just a different mindset. So instead of waiting, ooh, May 1st, the Alexia grant opens up, I'm going to apply for it. You say, I don't need Alexia. I'm going to go apply or not apply. I'm going to go contact these people because they're interested in X. I'm interested in X, and this is the relationship that I think we can have. So in a way, it's also, you kind of have to take on a little bit more, definitely you have to be more proactive, but that means you really need to be able to articulate what it is that you're doing. That's why writing is so sort of important for you. Now, there are grants like Aftermath, for example. Alexia, I'm a little bit out of the photojournalism world lately, but I'm sure there's others that they're not necessarily like geographic based. They're open up to anyone and everyone. Like some of the grants that I have mentioned, they're for citizens of that country or residents of that country. Canada Council for the Arts. I'm a Canadian citizen, therefore I apply. I lived in the Netherlands, so because I lived there, now I live in Finland. So that's kind of how you go through it. But I do think that there are more opportunities than you really think, but it just sort of takes a slightly different way of calibrating um, what you understand a funder to be and how they can potentially be. So see it, I'll give you one last example. Again, it's semi-Western to a certain degree, but I was hired by I can never say it, OCSC, Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. Election something rather. Anyways, I was hired for a 6-week job in Kosovo to photograph the first election since declaring independence from Serbia. It was like 10 years ago, 12 years ago. Um, but they didn't pay. But they're like, we'll give you expenses or like, yeah, expenses, car, hotel, food, blah, 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 but we can't give you a fee. I thought, well, that's a bummer. That's a 6-week job. I'm not going to make any money, but I really wanted to go to Kosovo. So I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm going to do it. But then that really made me think, I got to make some money out of this situation. So what am I going to do? And I remember on like one of my first days, we drove by this fantastic building in the capital called Pristina, which is like the library. And it looks, I don't know, a spaceship. I was like, what is this? It's the library. Oh no, it's the archive. And the archive, isn't that an interesting concept? Here's a brand new country that has an archive. And what am I doing? I'm documenting a historical event of the first sort of free elections post-independence. And I was kind of really intrigued by that idea of an archive, which is a repository of history, right? It's things from the past that you kind of keep as a record. But here was a nation that was a year old. So I made an appointment, and yes, I'm a Western foreign photographer, so I was kind of like an honored guest, so to speak. But I met the director. I told him what I was doing. I came with a couple of photographs. I just quickly went to like the local print lab, and I printed out some like 8x10s. I said, this is what I'm doing. What do you think? Archives, elections, history, Kosovo. And he's like, fantastic. I'll buy 15 prints from you when you're done for a set fee. And I said, that's wonderful. Like, there it is. There's a lot more to it than that, but the point being is like being able to identify opportunities that don't traditionally say present themselves to you. So it's just kind of, again, really knowing what it is that you're doing, knowing who the potential institution is, etc. So yeah, you are at a disadvantage, but in the same sense, you have a great advantage because you now have access to these kinds of things. You're a storyteller, you're a photographer, you've got something to say. Now articulate it and just start to sort of point your finger towards interesting organizations. And I don't know where you live, but there's all kinds of even hyper local groups that you could potentially have a relationship with. And then the last thing I want to say, it's not always about money. Of course, it's a wonderful thing, but it's also about opportunity and access, and what say realms can you enter through developing collaborations and partnerships. Because maybe the first thing is to sort of start making a relationship, and then through that relationship you meet somebody else, and then through that somebody else, maybe then they'll fund it, blah, 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 right? So it is this kind of chain reaction that happens.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think sometimes you need to think a little bit from the project and what you can then apply to it, and who can be the link, you know. It's not just one grant, but it's many different probably organizations, institutions, foundations, and places that you can outreach just to, yeah, maybe make small bits of budget that fall into like this a bigger budget that you
Yeah.
have for the project. Okay, so yeah, we're almost in 2 hours. So I think if there's no further questions, I will just mention again our partners at Photoings and their resource center. I will add it to let me just copy it to our chat. Because also next end of the week, you have a great opportunity. Photoings are doing with the Everyday Projects and Black Women Photographers classes, the season 5 of their essentials. So I'll also paste that link in the chat, because I think you will also have a lot of great conversations there, and also some advice on not necessarily grant writing, but I'm sure there will be a lot of advice on how to really engage people with your work, how to reach audiences, and how to, I'm looking at it now, how to create a sustainable practice with your work, which I think grants are quite a big part of it, but not everything. But I'm very happy, Donald, that we got an insight into how you approach grants. And also seeing your projects, because I think we could learn a lot on the approach and actually where to start, and how to reach out and how to reach as many audiences as possible with your project, because at the end it's really, that's the goal of each project that I think you're creating, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, thanks for having me. It's nice to be at least for an hour and a half a part of the VII world again. So thank you, everyone, and good luck.
Thank you so
Just
much.
start writing now. That's the one thing I would say. Take one piece and just write without thinking. Just put stuff down. Yeah.
Yeah, and then we can have an exercise. We can, if anyone wants to come to the next community hangout to review what you wrote, we can all do it together. I think community is also a very nice place for you to comment on each other's work, review what we did, and this is really a community that was created for peer-to-peer learning, not just learning from all the experts that we're so grateful to have. But yeah, I encourage you also to work with each other and share things with each other. Donald, was really fantastic having you back at the foundation.
Yeah.
And we do hope, yeah, to meet at another occasion. We have other programs going on, and we can be in touch for another workshop or something in the future years. So we're very grateful for your presence and the presentation. Have a good evening to everyone, or good morning. Bye bye.
Good morning. See you, everyone. Bye.